Here we are going to examine the structures belonging to the large intestine. The large intestine is approximately 5 to 6 feet in length, so that means it is shorter than the small intestine. However, its diameter is about 2.5 to 2 3/4 of an inch, which makes it much wider than the small intestine. Its major function is to absorb water from the undigestible food residues that are leaving the small intestine. So recall that gastric, pancreatic, and intestinal juices require a large amount of water. And so we see that the large intestine is going to reclaim some of this water. It is important to note here that most water absorption, so like most nutrient absorption, is going to occur in the small intestine, and we're going to see that the large intestine is simply finishing what the small intestine started. We'll also see that bacteria that are located in the large intestine will produce vitamins. So the only digestion that occurs in the large intestine is by the bacteria that are located here to produce vitamins such as certain vitamin Bs as well as vitamin K. The absorptive functions include absorbing some water from food residue, absorbing electrolytes, so primarily sodium chloride, and absorbing the vitamins that are produced by the bacteria that are located in the large intestine. It also functions in propulsion of fecal material towards the rectum and elimination of feces by defecation. The large intestine frames the small intestine. So we see that even though the small intestine is missing from this diagram, it is coiled within the borders of the large intestine. The ileum of the small intestine opens into the cecum of the large intestine. The cecum is the beginning region or the initial region of the large intestine. And a small valve that's called the ileocecal valve controls flow of food residue from the small intestine into the large intestine. From the cecum, the large intestine proceeds vertically into a region called the ascending colon. The ascending colon then turns horizontally and becomes the transverse colon. From there, the transverse colon becomes the descending colon, and the descending colon becomes the sigmoid colon. The sigmoid colon then becomes the rectum and the anal canal. The large intestine has two 90-degree turns that are called flexures. The right colic flexure is located between the ascending colon and the transverse colon. It is also called the hepatic flexure due to its proximity to the liver. The left colic flexure is located between the transverse colon and the descending colon. It is also called the splenic flexure due to its proximity to the spleen. The appendix is a worm-like structure that is connected to the cecum. It contains masses of lymphatic tissue that act in immunity, and it also acts as a site for bacterial storage. Bacteria in the large intestine are capable of recolonizing the gut from populations within the appendix. In general, the large intestine has several main structures that are seen on its surface. The first are the tinea coli. These are 3 bands of longitudinal, so that is lengthwise, smooth muscle located in the muscularis externa. The pull from the muscle in the tinea coli folds the walls of the large intestine into pocket-like sacs that are called haustra. And finally, we see that there are small appendages called the epiploic appendages that are fat-filled pouches of the visceral peritoneum that hang from the large intestine. So multiple sources have cited no known function for these. However, we could probably assume that the adipose tissue that's within the epiploic appendages does what it does in other parts of the body. So that is, adipose tissue stores energy and also acts as a soft padding and protective tissue for delicate organs. So here we see the haustra, the epiploic appendages, as well as the tinea coli. The rectum and the anal canal are the last segments of the large intestine. We see that there are small valves located in the rectum, which are called rectal valves, that prevent fecal material from being passed along with gases that are created. There are 2 sphincters at the end of the anal canal, the external anal sphincter and the internal anal sphincter. The external sphincter is voluntarily controlled because it is composed of skeletal muscle, and therefore we have conscious control over it. This sphincter allows us to control defecation when it is convenient. The internal anal sphincter is involuntarily controlled because it is composed of smooth muscle. It is controlled primarily by the autonomic nervous system, and it responds to stretch that is caused by feces located in the sigmoid colon. The mucosa of the large intestine contains a simple columnar epithelium, which is very similar to what we saw in the small intestine. However, unlike in the small intestine, it lacks the circular folds and the villi that we saw in the small intestine. Since the large intestine does not function in absorption as much as the small intestine does, this makes a lot of sense. It does contain abundant mucus-producing goblet cells. The mucus that they produce helps to keep stools moving through the large intestine. We also see that there are anal sinuses located between structures called anal columns that also produce mucus to aid in passing stools. The large intestine does contain, as we mentioned previously, a number of different bacteria. There are approximately 1,000 different types of bacteria that enter the large intestine from either the small intestine or from the anus in order to colonize the large intestine. The bacterial population, which is often referred to as the bacterial flora, function to ferment indigestible carbohydrates, which produces gases like carbon dioxide, as well as acids that can potentially irritate the large intestine. These products are normal byproducts of bacteria breakdown and bacterial metabolism. The bacteria also synthesize a number of useful substances for us. In particular, they can synthesize a few types of B vitamins as well as vitamin K. Both vitamins are needed by the liver in order to produce several clotting factors that are important in blood clotting. We see that chyme residue tends to remain within the large intestine for approximately 12 to 24 hours so that water can be absorbed, but also so that the bacteria that are located there can metabolize some of the things that we were not able to digest yet and produce things like vitamins. The large intestine itself does not break down food. Only the bacteria that inhabit the large intestine are involved in digestion. And they use some of the indigestible materials for their own metabolic processes. So in doing so, these bacteria will create some vitamins. We mentioned earlier, there are certain B vitamins that they create, as well as vitamin K. The large intestine does function to also absorb some water and some electrolytes. In particular, it absorbs things like sodium chloride. The process of defecation describes movements of fecal material towards the rectum in order so that that fecal material can be eliminated from the body. The parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system controls the internal anal sphincter. So because this sphincter is smooth muscle, we have conscious control, on the other hand, over the external anal sphincter because this sphincter is skeletal muscle. We see that fecal material must pass through these two sphincters when they are relaxed in order to be eliminated from the body. And we have conscious control over the external anal sphincter so we can defecate only when it is convenient to do so. The stimulus for defecation is stretch of the walls of the rectum. This stretch is the stimulus for a simple reflex arc that communicates with motor neurons located in the spinal cord. These motor neurons then cause the internal anal sphincter to relax and also cause smooth muscle in the walls of the rectum to contract. So this will do two things. This will help to move masses of fecal material towards the rectum from the sigmoid colon and also allow that fecal material to leave the body through defecation. We do, as I mentioned before, have control over defecation, as it is not always convenient to do so. We see that neurons from the cerebral cortex communicate with somatic motor neurons in the spinal cord. These somatic motor neurons give us conscious control over the external anal sphincter, which is composed primarily of skeletal muscle. So until this point, we've examined how the large intestine functions normally. So let's examine some imbalances in large intestine homeostasis. One such condition is appendicitis, which is caused by acute inflammation of the appendix. The inflammation may be caused by fecal blockages, which has the potential to trap infectious bacteria within the appendix. So just like inflammation in other parts of the body, we see that appendicitis is characterized by swelling and fluid accumulation. This swelling and fluid accumulation could cause the appendix to rupture if the appendix swells to extensive levels. And if the appendix ruptures, that would cause fecal material as well as bacteria to enter the abdominal cavity and cause further infections there. Clostridium difficile, aka C. diff, is a bacteria that is normally found in the large intestine. It is extremely resistant to antibiotics. So we see that if other intestinal bacteria are destroyed, typically by excessive dosages of very strong antibiotics, this bacterium has the ability to take over and become the predominant bacteria within the large intestine. So when this happens, the effects are not much different than bacterial infections in other parts of the body. We see that C. diff causes inflammation of the colon, which can lead to diarrhea. So diarrhea are stools that contain too much water. So this can result from inflammation as well as infections of the large intestine, as that causes fluid accumulation. Or it can also be caused by jostling of the large intestine, which moves food residue more quickly through the large intestine, allowing less time for water absorption. So prolonged diarrhea can create dehydration as excessive amounts of water are lost, and it can also create electrolyte imbalances, particularly losses of potassium, along with the losses of water that occur. We see that constipation is the opposite of diarrhea, and it occurs when too much water is absorbed from the food residues. This causes stools to become hard and more difficult to pass. The constipation could be a result from dehydration, could be a result from insufficient fiber in the diet, as fiber is undigestible, helps to promote stool movement. And one interesting thing that we see that promotes the continued constipation is abusing laxatives. As it's interesting because laxatives are meant to relieve constipation. So abusing laxatives actually causes constipation to become worse. So because initially laxative use is tied to getting more water into the stools in order to get those stools to pass easier. So we take laxatives to put a little bit more water into the stools in order to get them to move through the large intestine much more easily. But laxative abuse results in dehydration because chronic use of laxatives cause dehydration through excessive water loss. This is going to feed back and make stools harder to pass and cause the very thing that they were meant to help treat.